Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? My name is Keegan, and I'm not in the most positive of moods today. I've spent most of my day reading an absolute flurry of Supreme Court decisions that have been very disappointing. I really don't want to cover them all. I will say one, though, that the Supreme Court has decided that should the executive revoke temporary protective status from people, that he has the final decision on it. That's fun. But anyway, what am I interested in talking about today? Well, I had an interesting conversation with a family member. I was pointing out some of the things, an argument I got in with one of these cultists, and how I always think it's really amusing when they decide to finally just stop trying to pretend that they know anything at all, and they just immediately say something like, "You have TDS." And then I just talk shit. I just immediately just start ripping into them, because what are they going to do? But I was telling my family member about this situation I'd had, and they said to me, "What's TDS?" And then I explained, I said, it's when these morons, say Trump derangements, and they say you're deranged because you hate Trump. And she hadn't heard that either. And this is someone who would profess to be plugged in, would say that they are informed. And in my mind, the argument has been made to me that if you've never heard that acronym, or you've never even heard the full sentence, that's because you're not chronically online. But I actually disagree with that point pretty staunchly, because, again, the point I'm about to make is nothing but anecdotal, personal experience. But as someone who has been to several protests, and when these people, drive by, sometimes there's a few counter protesters, they shout, they yell things because they're insecure little men. 99% of the time, men. But something they'll frequently shout is Trump derangement syndrome, or TDS. They'll drive by at protests I've been on that are on the side of busy roads, and they'll drive by and yell it out of their windows. So anyone who says that it's chronically online, in my mind, either you are somehow pretty insulated from these people out in public, or you're not going to protests. You're not talking to people out in public, Like, I'm someone who's worked at gas stations and fast food and, grocery stores. A lot of the work I have done deals with the public. So I don't have a choice but to come across these people. And me personally, I think, regardless of the consequence of me confronting people, even while I'm on the job, confronting customers as well as my coworkers, it doesn't matter to me if the consequence is that I'll keep losing my jobs, or whatever the case may be. I think it is phenomenally important that we, decent folk, establish a public set of norms. Like, if I was at my job at a gas station and somebody came in wearing a Klan hood, if I could keep myself from beating the shit out of them right then and there, I still would not be nice. In fact, honestly, I would probably immediately tell them to get the fuck out of my store, whether my job agreed with that stance or not. And then if they said he can be here, it's a Klan hood. I know this is an extreme example, but MAGA is the Klan. They are Confederates. They're Nazis. They're a fusion of all of those ideologies. So to me, when I see one come in, anywhere in public, It doesn't even have to be while I'm on the job. I can be shopping at Walmart. When I see them, the only thing I see is, in my head, because most of them are men, especially if they're wearing it in public, I see someone who is either A, a pedophile, or B, a defender of pedophiles. And boy, does that get my blood boiling. You know, it's our job to make sure that that shit is unacceptable in public. And I understand that's easier for me to say because I grew up in a culture of poverty. And if you have anybody who has ever spent any significant time, especially if they grew up impoverished, then you know poor people don't have a lot. Oftentimes they really don't have anything. So the one thing that they do have is their pride. And honor culture pops up in impoverished places. So people, well, that's why a lot of poor people are in a lot of fights. We don't have a lot to lose, you know? And in fact, in our neighborhoods, in our communities that are all equally as impoverished, they all equally don't have as much to lose. If you whoop somebody's ass and you go to jail, you get out and come back to the neighborhood, you're a fucking hero. And you barely lost anything. What are they gonna do, fine you? You don't even have money to pay your medical bills. Why do you care? And now your neighborhood thinks that you're a tough guy or something like that. You know? Especially if you beat up some asshole who just wouldn't keep his mouth shut. Then the whole neighborhood loves you. Yeah, you've got a case, but you were never gonna get a great job anyway. So I understand someone like me who has lived in this kind of a culture his whole life I have very little financially and materially to lose by confronting these people regularly. But in my opinion, it is a lack of all of us establishing these norms in public from the very beginning of all this that allowed it to fester and grow. Now, I see people who say that, you know, they're not willing to do things because they're afraid of losing their jobs. Well, then what will you sacrifice? What is it? If you're too afraid to lose your job, if you're too afraid of losing things in order to fight off a movement that is going to take your life one day if it is allowed to continue to go for decades and decades unchecked, then how can you possibly fight this? What can you do? I understand the necessity of our side needing finances, needing money, but I don't see significant efforts to stop this movement. They're better at financing each other and keeping their movement going than we are, at least by my estimation. But it can't be made normal in public, and to me it never will be normal. I don't care. I could have finished my degree and ended up as a defense attorney. Or maybe I could have even gotten elected. If I'd have seen somebody walking in anywhere with a Klan hood, oh my God. They'd be lucky to get away without bleeding. And in that circumstance, I would have more to lose. But it doesn't matter, because to me it's good men that establish those kinds of norms in public. You know, you don't have a bunch of men, at least around in my community, you don't have a bunch of men going around slapping 16-year-old girls' asses, because men like me would kick their ass. We have failed to establish that exact same norm when it comes to a political movement, because they have power and influence and they can exact consequences on us. But conversely, we can exact consequences on them. And most of the jobs that each of us are trying to maintain are fueling the billionaires who are making this collapse of democracy happen in the first place. So it's a vicious circle. And we have to be, I've criticized the idea that it's going to take 3.5% of the population to protest at once to make a difference. And that very well could work, but in my mind, we're going to have to face that reality at some point anyway. Like, either because we protest or because we are willing to go to war to defend people's rights. That's it. And I am a little more animated about this today because of the Supreme Court decisions. These Supreme Court decisions that are coming down now, in roughly 3 weeks, I've talked about this before, is the Supreme Court will be passing a decision on whether or not the executive can just decide who is and isn't a citizen. I'm simplifying a bit, but that is basically what they're going to be able to do. And that is in 3 weeks. And the flurry of decisions they're making now on other cases is making me more and more convinced that they will actually give him that power. And then what are you going to do? At that point, when it is no longer any illusion of democracy, and you're still just protecting your jobs, well, then you're doing what the Germans did during Nazi Germany. You just got to keep working because you just got to keep paying your bills, which all of that money that you pay in your bills and all the money, the revenue you generate for your job is going straight to the very people who made this situation happen in the first place and are continuing to make it happen. Again, it's easy for someone as poor as me to say, but at the end of the day, no matter how much we worked, no matter how much we've made personally, we are all going to end up in the same place. And in the instance of a fascist movement rising, that could happen significantly sooner to all of us than we ever expected that it would. So, I think that's about all I've got today. I'm keeping an eye on the Supreme Court. You know, like I say, if they start taking away people's citizenship willy-nilly, I mean, then we fight or die. Because that's it. That's the moment. That's what they're working toward, in my opinion. So, I leave you all with this. I hope you all are doing well, and stay safe.